I suppose if I were to start anywhere, it would be with the mornings, because mornings reveal more about a man's life than evenings ever could. And in my case, the mornings are quiet, drawn out, a little heavy, and filled with the sound of the wooden tip of my walking stick touching the floor before my feet do. I am 77 years old, and though people around me are always eager to label me as elderly, frail, and halfway out of this world, I have never thought of myself as an invalid. The walking stick I carry has become an extension of me, not a mark of my weakness, but the very reason I am still upright and breathing. Because after the fall 2 years ago and the surgery that followed, the doctor was blunt enough to say that had I not been careful, had I insisted on moving without support, I might not have been here to tell the tale. So each morning when the sun enters through the thin curtains of my modest little house, I rise slowly, not with the impatience of a younger man, but with the deliberate pace of someone who knows that every movement counts, that every step requires attention. And as I place my hand on the smooth, dark handle of the stick, I am reminded of my late wife, and of the many times she told me not to let pride become my undoing. It is not simply a stick. It is carved oak, polished by time and my grip, given to me by Eleanor on our 40th wedding anniversary, back when neither of us thought that a day would come when I would truly need it. She gave it half-jokingly with a little ribbon tied around the handle, saying that one day, if I insisted on climbing ladders to fix the gutters myself, she would demand that I at least use something to keep me balanced. I laughed then. She laughed too, and we leaned the stick in a corner of the hallway where it gathered dust for years, until that fateful slip on the icy front steps brought it back into my life, as though it had been waiting silently for its true purpose to emerge. Now, alone in this house that once seemed too small for two and now seems too large for one, I perform my rituals carefully. I brew coffee in the same old percolator we bought in the 70s, stubbornly refusing the new machines my daughter once tried to push on me, because I know the sound and smell of this one, and I prefer the slow process of waiting for the first bubbles and the deep aroma filling the kitchen. I toast bread, spread a little butter, sometimes an egg if I feel my stomach has the strength for it, and I carry my breakfast to the table with the deliberate dignity of a man who still believes in order, even if no one is there to see it. The stick follows me always. It leans against the table, against the counter, by the chair, like a silent companion. In the quiet, I sometimes talk to it, or rather to the memory of Eleanor that clings to it. And though I know it would sound ridiculous to anyone listening, to me it is as natural as breathing. My world has grown smaller these past years, not only because of age, but because of choices made by others, choices that have carved lines between me and the very people who should have been closest. My daughter, my only child, lives only 20 minutes away, yet I see her less in a year than I used to see traveling neighbors in a week. She has her own family now, her husband, her children who are no longer children, and though I once imagined that old age would bring us together, it seems to have done the opposite. I have become, in her eyes, a responsibility at best, an inconvenience at worst. I can sense it in her tone, the way she speaks to me as though I were a guest who overstayed his welcome, the way she pushes conversations toward practical matters. Money, houses, wills, medical appointments. She is practical, like her mother used to say, but I call it calculating. And while Eleanor always softened my words, saying that our daughter was only careful, I knew even then that the line between careful and cold is thinner than most believe. I spend my afternoons in silence, reading newspapers that pile up more out of habit than necessity, attempting crossword puzzles where half the names are of young celebrities I do not know, and sometimes walking slowly to the park 2 blocks away to feed the ducks People pass me by. Some nod politely. Others smile with that peculiar pity reserved for the old. But most glance once at the stick and then look away quickly, as though the sight of it reminds them of something they do not wish to face. I know that look, because I once wore it myself when visiting my own father in his declining years. And though I promised I would never reduce another human being to an object of pity, I see it reflected in the eyes of my neighbors, my daughter, even my grandchildren. It is the look that says, "Here stands the reminder of time, of decline, of mortality. The walking stick speaks before I do." Evenings are lonelier still, for that is when the ghosts of memory walk through the rooms. I sit by the radio more than the television, because voices soothe me more than images do, and I sometimes fall asleep in my chair with the stick resting against my knee. On colder nights, I trace the carvings along the handle, remembering Eleanor's fingers tying that ribbon, her laughter, the warmth of her hand in mine. The house creaks, the clock ticks, and I am left with the weight of my years and the silence that swallows everything. I often think about how family gatherings once filled these walls with noise, with children running about, with laughter that came not at my expense, but from genuine joy. Those days are gone. And now, when the phone rings, I already know it is not for conversation, but for requests, small at first, then larger, and always wrapped in the language of necessity. And so, this is my introduction, if it can be called that. A man who wakes each day with the help of a stick once given in jest, who lives in a house that has become a museum of his own past, who clings to the memory of love stronger than to the living family that remains, and who carries, along with his cane, a simmering mixture of pride, sorrow, and suspicion. I have been mocked more times than I care to admit, laughed at by those who should have defended me, and each time I have chosen silence, thinking that dignity meant endurance. But silence, I'm beginning to realize, can sometimes be a greater weakness than any limp, and endurance without resistance is nothing but surrender. My stick is no longer only for walking. It has become a witness, a confidant, and perhaps, though I could not have imagined it yet, the very tool with which I will one day strike down, not my enemies with violence, but the lies they spread around me, lies that cut deeper than any wound to the flesh. It began innocently enough, or at least that is how they made it seem, with an invitation that sounded more like an announcement than a request. A phone call from my daughter that came on a Wednesday afternoon when the sky outside was gray and my knees were aching from the rain, her voice brisk and confident, as though she were speaking not to her father, but to an assistant she expected to obey. She told me that the family would be celebrating my grandson's birthday in their new house, the one I had helped them buy but was never invited into, and that of course I should attend, because it would look strange if I did not, and because appearances matter even if family bonds no longer do. I accepted, partly because the alternative was another evening alone, partly because I still wanted to believe that there remained a possibility of closeness, and partly because something in me hoped that perhaps, for the sake of her son, my daughter, might soften, at least for one day. I pressed my shirt, polished my shoes, and even used a touch of the cologne Eleanor had once loved on me, though the bottle was nearly empty and years old, because I wanted to arrive not as the picture of frailty they expected, but as a man who could still hold himself with dignity. When I arrived, walking carefully up the pathway with my stick, I noticed immediately how the laughter inside dimmed when the door opened, how the brightness of conversation lowered a notch as though someone had just turned down the music. My daughter greeted me with a smile that carried no warmth, the kind of smile one gives to a neighbor dropping off misdelivered mail. My son-in-law remained seated at the dining table, raising his glass lazily in my direction, as if acknowledging the presence of a burden. I handed my grandson his gift, a watch I had saved for from my modest pension, and the boy accepted it with the distracted indifference of someone already focused on the larger, flashier boxes piled on the table. I told myself not to take it personally, that children are shaped by the adults around them, and that perhaps he did not know how to appreciate thoughtfulness over spectacle. It was during the meal that the first barbs were thrown, disguised as jokes, as they so often are, designed not to amuse, but to cut. My daughter, slicing the roast, looked at me and said with an exaggeratedly sweet tone, "Dad, don't forget to keep that stick nearby. We wouldn't want you wandering off and forgetting where you sit." The table erupted in laughter, even the children, giggling, and I forced a smile, though inside I felt the flush of shame. I tried to respond lightly, reminding her that it was the stick that kept me steady enough to attend. But before the words left my mouth, my son-in-law chimed in with his booming voice. "We should tie a bell to it, like for a cow, so we can always find him when he shuffles away." More laughter, louder this time, the kind that does not fade quickly, the kind that lingers like a slap echoing in a hallway. I lowered my gaze to my plate, cutting my meat carefully so that they would not see my hands trembling. As the evening went on, the remarks continued, each one sharper than the last, always directed toward the stick, but meant unmistakably for me. When I excused myself to stand and stretch my legs, my grandson darted across the room and grabbed the cane, waving it around like a toy sword, shouting, "Look at me, I'm Grandpa. I can't walk without my crutch." Everyone laughed again, and though my daughter eventually told him to return it, her tone was playful, indulgent, as if she found his mockery charming. I took the stick back silently, gripping it more tightly than before, not because I needed it at that moment, but because it was the only thing stopping me from walking out the door. Later, when dessert was served, the conversation shifted toward practical matters, as it always seemed to when I was present. My son-in-law, in that falsely casual way of his, asked whether I had given more thought to making arrangements for my property, saying it would be wise to ensure that things were in order. Before, as he put it, your memory gets as wobbly as your knees. My daughter nodded approvingly, adding that she had found some excellent care facilities where I would be comfortable, where I would not need to bother with the strain of living alone. The implication was clear. They wanted me to surrender not only my independence, but the remnants of my authority, to sign away control under the guise of convenience. The other guests at the table, friends of theirs from work and neighbors from the new development, shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing that the conversation had turned from light-hearted to cruel. But no one spoke in my defense. I felt the room tilt, not from dizziness, but from the realization that I was being staged, presented before witnesses as someone fragile, incapable, ready to be placed aside. The laughter that had begun with the stick was merely the prelude. The true purpose was to establish a narrative, to begin weaving a story that I was not simply old, but incompetent, not merely slow, but incapable of decision. I forced myself to eat the cake, though it tasted of ashes, to drink the coffee, though it scalded, and to nod politely, though every word cut deeper. I told myself I could endure this one evening, that silence was still better than confrontation. But somewhere deep inside, a seed of anger was planted, one that pulsed with every joke, every sideways glance, every mocking reference to the object I carried in my hand. They thought the stick was proof of my decline, a prop to expose my weakness. They could not imagine that it might one day become the very instrument through which I would steady not only my body, but my dignity. When I left, later than I wished, escorted half-heartedly to the door by my daughter, who pressed me to consider those care facilities once more, I stepped out into the night air with the stick tapping against the walkway, each tap echoing like a drumbeat, like a promise. They had mocked what they did not understand, and in doing so, they had awakened something in me that had long been dormant. The stick was not just wood and polish. It was memory, resilience, resistance. And though I did not yet know how, I felt certain that the very thing they used to humiliate me would one day expose them for what they truly were. The days after that birthday dinner weighed on me more heavily than I first admitted. For though I tried to dismiss the sting of their laughter as nothing more than poor taste or ill-judged humor, the memory returned each night with a sharpness that would not dull, and I found myself replaying the words over and over, trying to understand whether my daughter and her husband were simply careless or whether there was something colder beneath their remarks. It is remarkable how words spoken once can echo in a man's head for weeks, gathering power each time they resurface. And I realized that in their laughter was a warning, not simply a jest. They were preparing a stage, a carefully crafted image of me that they could present not just in private circles, but to the world beyond. An image of a man faltering, unable to manage his own affairs, unsteady both in gait and in judgment. A man whose stick was no longer just a tool, but a symbol of dependency and frailty. I noticed the change immediately in the way they addressed me on the phone afterward. For my daughter called not to ask how I was, but to instruct, her voice clipped, efficient, as though she were speaking to an employee who had forgotten his duties. She reminded me, in tones half mocking and half scolding, to take my medications, though I had never once neglected them, and she asked whether I had considered her suggestion about simplifying my life by letting them handle the house, the bills, the accounts, as if I were already incapable of balancing a checkbook or remembering to pay the utility company. Each question was wrapped in the language of care, but the sharpness underneath was unmistakable. And the more she spoke, the more I felt myself being nudged toward a role I had no desire to play, that of the doddering father who could not be trusted with his own existence. On one particularly damp afternoon, she arrived without warning, carrying grocery bags as though she were delivering charity to the needy, and while I thanked her politely, I noticed her eyes moving around the room, scanning for signs of neglect or disorder. Eager to find proof of her theory, she lingered by the sink, lifting a plate that had been left to dry, remarking that perhaps it was time I hired someone to help keep things in order. She glanced at the medicine bottles on the counter and frowned, as if expecting to find them scattered or mislabeled. And when she found nothing out of place, she sighed theatrically, saying that I was still managing for now, but that it was better to make plans before matters grew urgent. I asked her plainly what she meant, and she replied, with the smooth confidence of someone who had rehearsed her lines, that she and her husband had been looking into assisted living arrangements, comfortable places, safe, where I would not have to struggle with stairs or loneliness. The word loneliness was twisted into a weapon, and though she spoke it with apparent concern, I could hear the calculation in it, the recognition that guilt could be leveraged as easily as fear. I told her I was not interested, that the house was mine, and that I had no intention of leaving it while I still drew breath. But she smiled, with that thin, superior smile I remembered from her teenage years, the one Eleanor used to soften with patience, but which now stood naked and unrestrained. And she replied that, "We will see," as though the matter were not mine to decide. She left shortly afterward, leaving the groceries on the counter like an offering to her own benevolence. And as I watched her drive away, I felt a chill, not from the weather, but from the realization that my daughter no longer saw me as her father, but as an obstacle to be managed, a problem to be solved. In the weeks that followed, small incidents accumulated, each one minor in itself, but together forming a pattern too clear to ignore. At the bank, I discovered that my daughter had attempted to inquire about my accounts, claiming she was helping me organize my finances. The clerk, who had known me for years, politely but firmly refused, yet the attempt itself revealed more than words ever could. At the pharmacy, I was told that my daughter had called asking for details about my prescriptions, saying she was concerned I might forget them. Even my neighbor across the street, a kind widow who often exchanged pleasantries with me, mentioned that my daughter had asked her to keep an eye on me in case I seemed confused. Confused, such a simple word, yet heavy with implication, for confusion was not the same as forgetfulness. Confusion was the first brick in the wall they sought to build around me, the wall of incapacity that would allow them to claim authority over my life. The breaking point, however, came at another family dinner, this time less public. Only the immediate family gathered in their house. I had agreed to come reluctantly, still hoping that perhaps things might improve, that the earlier humiliations were mistakes rather than intentions. The evening began well enough, though I noticed immediately that my seat at the table had been placed at the corner, slightly apart, as though I were a guest rather than a patriarch. During the meal, my son-in-law, who had been drinking steadily, leaned back in his chair and with exaggerated concern asked me whether I remembered the names of all my grandchildren. I answered calmly, reciting each name without hesitation, but he smirked and said that perhaps I had only remembered because I had written them down on the cane. The children laughed. My daughter joined in, and though the joke was cruel, it was the laughter that cut deepest, for it confirmed that this was not spontaneous teasing, but a family ritual, a shared understanding that I was to be diminished for their amusement and for their narrative. When I stood to leave after dessert, my son-in-law picked up my cane and twirled it in his hand, saying loudly, "Careful, Dad. Don't forget which leg to use. We wouldn't want you toppling over." The laughter rang again, echoing against the walls of the house I had helped them buy, and I felt something in me harden. I reached out, took the cane back firmly, and though I said nothing then, though I walked out into the night in silence, inside me a decision was forming. They were not only mocking me, they were preparing the world to believe their version of me, and each laugh was another brick in the edifice of lies they were constructing. I realized then that the escalation was no longer subtle. They were moving quickly, and if I did not act, if I did not prepare, I would find myself cornered not by accident, but by design. The moment when everything tipped, when the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface rose into undeniable crisis, came not in a private conversation, but in front of a room full of strangers, which was precisely how they intended it, because humiliation delivered in private can be denied or forgotten, but humiliation inflicted before witnesses becomes a weapon sharpened with permanence. They had invited me, under the pretense of inclusion, to a neighborhood gathering at their house, one of those carefully curated suburban evenings where neighbors exchange pleasantries about lawns, promotions, and vacation plans. And though I had little desire to go, I allowed myself to be persuaded, partly because I still harbored the naive hope that perhaps in the presence of others my daughter might remember she had once loved me, and partly because I wanted to see whether my suspicions of her intentions were indeed true, or merely the inventions of an old man too accustomed to solitude. From the moment I entered, however, I could feel the atmosphere shift, as though my presence had been scripted into a play whose lines I did not know. My daughter introduced me not as her father with pride, but as her aging dad who sometimes forgets things but tries his best, and she laughed lightly as though it were a harmless joke. The neighbors smiled politely, but in their eyes I saw pity, and pity is a poison. For once it is planted, truth is no longer judged by reality, but by perception. I found myself standing awkwardly in a corner, leaning on my stick, listening as my son-in-law regaled the table with stories, and soon the stories turned to me. Small tales of supposed mishaps, of imagined confusions, told with such conviction that even I felt the ground shift beneath me. He spoke of the time I supposedly left the stove burning for hours, though it had never happened. He described how I had called him twice in the same day asking the same question, though no such call was ever made. And each story was followed by laughter, not the cruel laughter of the birthday dinner, but the indulgent laughter of people convinced they were witnessing the decline of age. The pivotal moment came when he reached beneath the table, pulled my stick toward him, and held it aloft like a trophy. "This," he declared, "is our family's metronome. Without it, Dad doesn't know which way to walk." Laughter erupted again, louder, and before I could stop myself, I reached for it, my hand trembling with a mixture of fury and desperation. But instead of handing it back, he passed it to one of the neighbors, who chuckled and tapped it against the floor, as though testing the sound of my dependence. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, the air heavy with amusement at my expense. And in that instant I realized that I was not simply the subject of their jokes, but the foundation of their strategy. They were building a case, weaving a tapestry in which I was the doddering fool, the forgetful relic, the fragile man whose decisions could no longer be trusted. I took the stick back eventually, after too much laughter had passed. And when I sat again, the silence in my chest was not the silence of surrender, but of decision. I knew then that what I had feared was true. Their goal was not to care for me, but to strip me of authority, to place me into the category of the managed, the supervised, the silenced. The humiliation of that evening was deliberate, staged to prepare witnesses who could later say they had seen for themselves how frail and confused I was. It was a rehearsal for a verdict they intended to pass in some courtroom or office, where papers would be signed and my name would be reduced to a signature beneath documents I did not understand. Walking home later that night, each step punctuated by the sharp sound of the stick against the pavement, I felt both rage and clarity. The cane they mocked, the object they paraded as evidence of my decline, was the very thing that steadied me now. And in its rhythm, I heard not defeat, but resolve. They thought they were pushing me toward a quiet submission, toward a corner where I would accept their version of me. But in reality, they had forced me to see them for what they were. And I knew with a certainty I had never felt before that the Time for silence had ended. I woke the next morning with the sour taste of that neighborhood performance still on my tongue, and told myself that a man can be mocked in public only so many times before either his pride dies or something sterner replaces it. And while I am not ashamed to admit that I have known plenty of moments when pride limped behind me like a second invisible cane, that day something else settled in. A kind of watchful steadiness that made me notice things I had previously waved away as coincidence or clumsy affection. Because once you accept that people you love are willing to turn your weakness into their script, you begin to see the props they are setting on the stage long before the curtain rises. My daughter called before noon in that bright, bossy voice that always seems to skip past tenderness and land on logistics. And she announced that she had scheduled a routine wellness visit with my doctor for the following week. The kind where they ask you to count backward by sevens and draw a clock with the hands pointing at a time they choose. And she said it as if she were arranging a haircut, breezy and practical. Yet when I asked who booked the appointment and why the sudden concern, she sidestepped the first question and told me she had read a helpful article about preparing for the later years, then added a line about how it would give everyone peace of mind. I heard what she did not say, which was that paper trails begin in CNT, waiting rooms, that files grow teeth once they carry the word cognitive, and that once a label is stapled to your name, you will spend the remainder of your days trying to peel it off while everyone assures you it is for your safety. 2 days later, she appeared at my door again without calling ahead. This time not with groceries, but with a folder and a smooth, rehearsed smile. And in the folder I could see the edges of forms, the stiff tongues of notarized pages, the tidy copies of things that wanted my signature much more than they wanted my welfare. And though she handed me the folder as if it were a birthday card, she did not let go of it right away. She held on just long enough to remind me that the content belonged to her plan, not my curiosity. Inside, laid out in a careful sequence, were documents proposing that I grant her durable power of attorney for convenience, that I authorize her to manage my accounts to reduce daily burdens, that I consent to allow medical decisions to be made. In the event of incapacity, a phrase that hung in the air like a trap disguised as a hammock. And at the back, nearly hidden beneath a glossy brochure for a cheerful place, with a name like a bird sanctuary, lay a draft letter to my bank authorizing temporary co-management, the sort of temporary that becomes permanent the minute you blink. I read slowly, and when I looked up, she was studying my face the way a card player studies a dealer's hands, searching for a tremor or a tell that would let her push the next move. And when I told her I would not sign anything without time to think and a chance to ask a lawyer what I was signing, she smiled as if I had made a charming joke and replied that of course I should take my time, then set the folder on the mantel beneath Eleanor's photograph as if to frame the entire request with a memory I wouldn't dare disturb. That evening, trying to walk the buzzing out of my head, I took the long way around the block to the small park, and on the bench nearest the pond, I found my neighbor's granddaughter, a college freshman home for a long weekend, a bright-eyed girl who had once helped me carry potting soil to my garden and who still greeted me without pity, which is rarer than kindness. And when she saw me, she waved, and then, after a fidgeting pause, asked in a low voice whether everything was all right, because she had been at a coffee place the previous afternoon and had overheard my son-in-law talking to a friend, bragging in that careless way men do when they want to sound competent, about getting the paperwork lined up, before I went sideways, and about how guardianship hearings were mostly a formality if you have documentation and coachable witnesses. And she blushed as she said it, half afraid to repeat what she'd heard, and half angry that she had to be the one to do it. I thanked her more than the words could carry, and I sat there after she left, watching the indifferent glide of ducks across the water, and I felt the world tilt again. But this time, it did not feel like the tilt of helplessness. It felt like the table had been turned sideways to show me the drawer where the rigged dice were kept. From that day, the small blows landed one after another, not enough to knock me down, but aimed precisely to make me stumble. And it is the cumulative cruelty of small things that ages a man faster than time. My mail began arriving late, or not at all, and when I asked at the post office, the clerk showed me a form requesting a temporary change of address to my daughter's house. A form I had not signed, a form stamped with my name in a hand that tried to imitate my tidy accountant's script and failed. And though the clerk apologized and reversed it, the seed had been planted. A week later, the utility company called to confirm that my account would be auto-debited from a new bank profile, one my daughter's, and when I told them it was unauthorized, the representative hesitated and then read back a phone authorization given by a voice, identifying as me, flat and scripted, a parody of my cadence. The pharmacy held my refill because your daughter said she would pick it up. And when I arrived in person, the clerk leaned over the counter with the stiff smile of someone briefed not to engage and told me there had been some confusion about my dosage, a word that had begun to follow me like a stray dog. And I went home holding my paper bag as if it might dissolve in my hands, wondering which of these threads they would pull hardest when the time came to tie the knot. I kept the folder on the mantel deliberately, where I could see it and choose not to sign it each morning, a small act of refusal that steadied my nerves. But I also began to assemble my own papers. Because a man who has spent 40 years reconciling books knows that every claim has a counter-entry if you look hard enough. I requested copies of my medical records. I wrote a letter to my doctor outlining in calm, measured language the tactics I believed were being used to shape a narrative of incapacity. I notified my bank in writing that no new authorizations were to be accepted without my in-person signature and a call to a number I provided, and I asked the bank manager, who had known Eleanor and me since we saved for our first down payment, to place a standing note in my file that any inquiries from my daughter should be routed to me. It felt at once humiliating and empowering. Humiliating to take such precautions against my own blood. Empowering to remind myself that I was still capable of prevention and not merely reaction. All the while the stick stood in its corner, and in the evenings I found myself wiping the handle with the same absent tenderness with which I once cleaned Eleanor's reading glasses. And one night, half curious and half restless, I unscrewed the small rubber ferrule at the bottom and discovered it came away easily, and inside the hollow I could have hidden a coin or a rolled-up note, and the thought flickered through me that a man mocked for the object in his hand might use that same object to hold a truth no one expected him to carry. Another dinner followed, smaller this time, just the family, and I came prepared to leave at the first sign of the theatrical. But the performance that night was more refined, less slapstick cruelty, more documentary tone, as if they had realized that the neighbor's laughter was less useful than a file of calm observations. My daughter asked soft questions with hard edges. Did I remember the names of the pills? Had I ever gotten lost on the way to the park? Did I feel safe carrying cash? And my son-in-law kept his voice as smooth as a banker's while describing the burdens of home maintenance and how difficult it must be to manage all those forms. And at the end, as dessert plates were lifted, my daughter placed a pen beside my saucer with the innocence of a hostess offering a mint and asked if perhaps I had looked over the documents and whether I might feel ready, for everyone's peace of mind, to initial just the parts that granted them the ability to help in an emergency. I looked at the pen, and I looked at the stick leaning against my chair, and I told her in a voice I recognized as my father's, a voice that appeared only when something final had to be said, that I would sign nothing that night and nothing ever, without my own counsel, and that if she placed that pen near me again, I would consider it an attempt to coerce. And I watched a flash of something, not anger exactly, but calculation frustrated by resistance, cross her face before she put on the sad, patient look the world loves to see on the caretakers of difficult old men. The next morning, 2 officers from the local department knocked on my door for a wellness check, polite and almost embarrassed, explaining that a concerned family member had reported that I had been wandering and sounded confused on the phone. And, though I invited them in and brewed coffee and chatted about minor league baseball until they were satisfied that I could tell the date, the president, the town, and the location of my thermostat, the visit left a chill in the walls long after they left. I realized then that the campaign was not just private pressure, but public groundwork, that if I did nothing, a file would accumulate its own momentum, and that when papers were finally carried into a courtroom, they would come not as a surprise, but as the culmination of many small, reasonable-sounding gestures. That afternoon I took the bus to a modest office above a bakery where a lawyer named Greer, a woman my age with a gaze like a carpenter's level, listened without interruption and then told me plainly that I was not paranoid, that elder guardianship is a tool easily twisted into a lever by impatient heirs, that the best defense is contemporaneous documentation, clean finances, and witnesses who are not related to those who would claim concern. She advised a fresh cognitive evaluation by an independent clinician and the execution of my own documents, limited powers of attorney to people I trusted, a living will, a notarized statement of intent, before anyone else tried to draft theirs for me. We drew them up over 3 visits, slow and careful, and I signed each one with hands that had steadied entire ledgers and now steadied my future. But escalation rarely yields to preparedness without testing the weakest seam, and mine, as they knew well, was the thin thread of hope that I might still be loved as something other than an obligation, which is why the cruelest blow did not come from a stranger or an officer or a bank clerk, but from my grandson, the one whose birthday had begun this charade, who came to hang out one Saturday afternoon with a box of pastries and a nervous charm, and who, after an hour of stories about campus life delivered with the hurried sincerity of someone on a time limit, asked whether he could see the old family photo albums because he wanted to scan a few pictures for a class project. I brought them out gladly, for I have always believed that to hand a young person a photo is to hand them a rope across time. But while he was flipping through the plastic sleeves, his phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. And for a second, one of those seconds that tilt a life, he looked at me, then at the phone, then at the stick by my knee, and the horror of recognition washed over his face. He had set the phone to record, the black circle stealthy in its corner, and he had hoped to capture a moment of confusion, a lapsed name, a lost thread, to feed a narrative that did not deserve to live. He stammered something about voice memos for his project, and I told him to take the pastries and go. And when the door closed, I sat with the albums on my lap, feeling not the weight of paper, but the weight of betrayal. And if ever I had been tempted to doubt my course, that temptation ended there. What I did next, I did without dramatics, because some of the most important acts in an old man's life happen without witnesses and without speeches. I bought a tiny recorder at the electronics store, the kind that could fit in a vest pocket, and I took the cane to my workbench in the garage where Eleanor used to pot her plants, and I unscrewed the ferrule again and slid the device into the hollow, so that the microphone faced the floor where sound travels upward like heat, and I practiced, alone and foolish-looking, the small shift of grip that would let me tap the stick once to start and twice to stop. Not because I wanted to trap them, though perhaps there was a flicker of that, but because I wanted a companion that could hear what I heard when I doubted my own memory, a witness that would not be persuaded by crocodile tears or rewritten recollection. I called my daughter and told her I would meet her and her husband the following week to discuss their concerns calmly, and I chose a cafe with tables close enough to make whispers carry, but not so close that they would suspect strategy. And when that day came, I wore Eleanor's ribbon pinned inside my jacket where no one could see it, a private reminder that love and strength were not mutually exclusive. Before that meeting, the blows continued with the clumsy confidence of people who believe momentum is on their side. A notice appeared from an insurance company I do not use, thanking me for authorizing a policy review with my representative, a word I had never applied to my daughter. The church office called to confirm I had requested a visit from the parish nurse, a kind volunteer who arrived with pamphlets about falls and end-of-life planning, and who left with a box of cookies after I thanked her sincerely for kindness misdirected at me by someone else's design. A handyman I had never met knocked on my door with a work order to evaluate home safety and install grab bars in a bathroom that did not need them. And when I told him I had not requested any such service, he glanced over my shoulder with the practiced eyes of a man paid to describe clutter as hazard and independence as risk. Each incident by itself could be explained away, but together they formed the shape of a net, and I could feel its threads tighten every time I refused to play my part. On the morning of the meeting, I woke early, brewed coffee strong enough to stand a spoon, and sat at the table with the stick across my knees, and I told myself that escalation had its purpose, that pressure reveals character, and that I would go not as a supplicant, but as a man who still knew the balance of his own life.
I arrived first, chose a chair with my back to a wall, because a wise man once told me that a corner is not only for the trapped, but for the watchful. And when my daughter and her husband floated in on a cloud of politeness, I smiled and asked them to
sit. They began with concern, and then, as concern failed to land, pulled out the folder again, thicker now, with notes from neighbors, with dates and times of alleged confusions, with a printout of the wellness check as if help offered counted as evidence of need. And as they spoke, I lowered my eyes to the table as though considering, and I rested the stick tip on the floor and gave it a single, accidental-sounding tap. They spoke of timelines and responsibilities, and it'll be easier on everyone. And when my son-in-law leaned forward and said they had already put wheels in motion for a capacity evaluation tied to paperwork at the bank so that nothing fell through the cracks, I raised my head and looked at them as if I were the one taking notes, as if I were the clinician evaluating the two people across from me who could not hear how loudly their desire sounded beneath their decorum. I did not argue, and I did not accuse, because I wanted their words, not my outrage, to do the work. And when they were finished, I told them I would consider everything they had said and would give them an answer after I had spoken with my own advisor. And I watched a muscle jump in my daughter's jaw and the first thin crack appear in my son-in-law's veneer, because escalation breeds impatience, and impatience breeds sloppiness, and sloppiness is what turns schemes into confessions. They left with hugs, the kind people give when they want the room to see them as loving, and I walked home with the recorder quiet in its little darkness and the cane steady in my hand. And for the first time since this began, I felt the balance shift, not because I had won anything yet, but because I had refused their script and written a few lines of my own. That night before I slept, I tapped the cane on the floor once, just once, and the sound of that small wooden knock folded into the silence of the house, like a pledge I intended to keep. The confrontation I had long dreaded finally arrived not with a quiet conversation or a gradual negotiation, but as a storm, sudden and loud, breaking through every last wall I had tried to hold between myself and my daughter's campaign. The day of the legal hearing for guardianship had been scheduled at the courthouse, a small brick building whose hallways smelled of dust and old paper, and I walked into it, with the cane steady in my hand, its hidden core of truth humming against my palm. And though I had lived through 1,000 calculations in my life as an accountant, I had never prepared for one quite like this, where the sum was my dignity and the cost was my freedom. They were already there, Beatrice with her hair pulled so tightly back that it looked as though she had tried to stretch her face into composure, and Thornton in a suit that fit too well for a man who claimed always to be struggling with expenses. They stood together, like prosecutors waiting for their witness, rehearsed and smiling with false pity. And when I entered the courtroom, their lawyer rose and declared, with a professional flourish, that they sought guardianship not to take anything from me, but to protect me, because, as he said, his clients were deeply concerned for my welfare. He spoke of my supposed confusions, the times I had allegedly forgotten names, left stoves burning, wandered without direction, all of which had been meticulously gathered into a dossier thicker than the Bible. And I could see in the judge's narrowed eyes that repetition had done its work. Lies repeated often enough start to take on the weight of fact. When my turn came, I rose slowly, the cane striking once against the wooden floor, a sound sharp enough to turn heads, and I spoke not as a lawyer, but as a man who has lived too long to be silenced by his own children. I told the judge I did not dispute my age. I did not deny the tremor in my hands or the gray in my hair. But age is not incapacity, and forgetfulness is not confusion. And the truth of my life was not in the stories they spun, but in the daily rituals I still performed. The balancing of my accounts down to the cent, the tending of my garden with orderly rows, the cooking of my own meals without incident. And then, with the quietest of gestures, I tapped the cane twice on the floor, and from within it came the recording I had hidden, the voices of my daughter and her husband in the cafe, where they had spoken freely of their scheme, their impatience, their plan to fabricate incapacity and hurry the process along. The room froze as their words spilled into the air, unmistakable and damning, and I stood silent, letting their own ambitions undo them. Thornton lunged forward, trying to protest that it was taken out of context, but the judge raised a hand, his expression stern, and Beatrice's face drained of color as the realization spread across the courtroom that their careful edifice had collapsed under the weight of their own tongues. For years they had laughed at my stick, ridiculed it as the emblem of weakness. But in that moment it became my witness, my weapon, and my salvation, and the irony was not lost on anyone present. The laughter they had used to strip me of dignity now echoed back at them as evidence of deceit, and the silence that followed was not mine, but theirs, heavy and choking. The judge dismissed the petition with words that sounded almost like an absolution, declaring me of sound mind and capable of my own affairs, and he admonished them with a severity I had not expected, warning them that further attempts at manipulation could cross the line into criminal fraud. Beatrice began to cry then, loud and messy, the way she used to as a child when caught in a lie. And Thornton put an arm around her, though his own eyes burned with something closer to fury than comfort. And I realized that in that instant they hated me, not for being frail, but for refusing to be the victim they had written into their script. I left the courthouse slowly, not triumphant but steady, the cane echoing on the steps. And for the first time in years I felt the weight lift from my chest. The climax was not in their downfall, not in the humiliation they tasted, but in the restoration of something I had nearly surrendered, the simple truth of who I was, a man still standing, still thinking, still choosing. They had tried to write me out of my own life, but I had spoken my lines with clarity, and the play ended not with their applause, but with their silence. I did not celebrate my victory with fanfare, or speeches, or a final burst of defiance, because the older I grow, the more I understand that real endings arrive quietly, like evening settling into a room you forgot to light. And what I wanted after the courthouse was not revenge, but space, not apologies dragged from unwilling mouths, but the simple right to chart the last stretch of my life without someone else's hand on the wheel. So I walked home by the long route past the library and the little hardware store where the owner still knows me by name, and with every measured tap of the cane I felt the heat of the last months cooling into something steadier, something like clean air after rain. The judge's words had stripped the lies of their costume, but there were still threads to cut and knots to loosen, which I did methodically, because method has always been my way of pushing back the chaos. I met with Greer and revised my will so that nothing could be seized in a moment of opportunistic grief. I moved my accounts to a credit union where the manager prints out every authorization and makes me sign in a hand. She has now seen enough times to spot a forgery at a glance. I completed a living will that says in unapologetic sentences, what should happen if someday my mind truly does fray, and to whom I grant the dignity of deciding when I cannot. And in that document I did not write my daughter's name, not from spite, but from the Hard clarity that love without trust cannot carry responsibility without breaking. I also took the photo albums from the hall closet and mailed a careful selection of duplicates to my grandchildren, with a letter longer than I first intended. A letter without accusations. Only stories, the way their grandmother once told stories. Across a table cluttered with mugs and cooling pie, because I thought that if anything survives of me in their lives, it should be the sound of my voice speaking plainly, and the record of what joy looks like when it is not yet ashamed of its own softness. Life did not snap back into place after that day. It unfolded instead into a new shape that I learned slowly and sometimes awkwardly, and I discovered that there is a freedom in small routines when you perform them for yourself alone, not as proof to doubters, nor as auditions for the role of still capable. So I returned to the park in the mornings and fed the ducks with the thrift of a man who has always kept count. I joined a Tuesday chess group at the senior center and found that my patience, once a tool of accounting, translates neatly into the art of waiting 3 moves for a careless bishop. I started cooking again with the radio on and Eleanor's old recipes folded open beside the cutting board, relearning the weight of flour in my palm and the sound of a boil becoming a simmer. On Sundays, I sit near the back pew at church, where the light finds the dust in the air and turns it into a visible river. And after the service, the parish nurse, who once arrived at my door by someone else's arrangement, now lingers by choice to talk about her garden, and sometimes I send her home with a jar of my soup because kindness should travel, and because the world is less lonely when favors wander back and forth across the street like unhurried cats. As for Beatrice and Thornton, there were phone calls at first, tight, wounded messages about reputations and family, and how could you do this to us? Then there was a letter from a different lawyer proposing reconciliation contingent on my acknowledgement of support needs. And finally, there was the soft and terrible silence that follows when people realize their leverage is gone. I do not rejoice in that silence, but I do not fill it either, and if grief still visits, it is grief for the shape of a family that could have been, not for the one that was. People ask whether I will forgive them, and I say that forgiveness is a door I keep unlocked for my own sake. Yet a door is not a bridge, and I do not intend to cross it unless they arrive without maps or excuses, and with hands not searching for pen. I have kept the cane, of course, and I treat it now the way men of earlier centuries tended their pocket watches, with a fond practicality that understands both usefulness and memory. For the stick that steadies me carries Eleanor's laughter in its grain and my better judgment in its hollow. And sometimes when I return from the market and close the door and feel the quiet rise to meet me, I lean it against the table and lay my palm on the polished curve of the handle, the way you might rest a hand on the shoulder of an old friend. I do not play the recordings anymore. They are locked in a drawer with documents and a list of numbers to call if trouble returns. And I find I do not need to hear those voices to remember what they taught me, which is that you can live long enough to see your weakness become your strength if you refuse to let someone else dictate the meaning of what you carry. A few months after the hearing, I took a portion of my savings, the portion I once set aside, in the quiet hope of passing something warm to my daughter, and I gave it to the community center to expand their after-school program. Because if money must move, let it move toward noise and laughter that do not hide knives inside them. And on the day they dedicated the reading room in Eleanor's name, I spoke not of betrayal, but of steadiness, of love that kept its appointments, of a woman who tied a ribbon around an unnecessary cane years before it became the instrument of our family's last honest scene. When I return home in the afternoons, the rooms no longer feel like a museum of what I have lost, but like a workshop for what remains. And although my steps are measured and my breath sometimes grows thin by the top of the staircase, I sleep now with a mind that no longer rehearses courtroom speeches. And I wake to mornings that are once again mine. The coffee strong, the window open, the cane within reach, not as a verdict, but as a companion. If there is a moral to all of this, and age loves to build morals where the young only see events, it is that dignity is not the absence of need, but the refusal to have one's needs turned into theater, and that love, to be worthy of the name, must never borrow the language of control. I cannot guarantee that the years ahead will not thin my memory or weaken my knees. But should that day come, the record will show that I chose the terms while I could, and that when the laughter rose around me, like a tide, I answered with the simplest knock of wood on floorboards, a small sound that nonetheless carried the whole of my name